If you've just joined, you've joined From Targeted Sanctions to Central Banks, the Future of U.S. Economic Sticks at the Quincy Institute. And we will start our panel in about a minute. People are still joining. Okay, let's go ahead and start. Welcome to today's Quincy Institute panel, From Targeted Sanctions to Central Banks, the Future of U.S. Economic Sticks. If you're not familiar with the Quincy Institute, we are a DC-based think tank that is dedicated to analyzing and advocating for policies rooted in restraint that support diplomacy and development over military intervention. And over the last 20 years, sanctions have become a favorite tool of US policymakers, and one that I'm personally skeptical about, but one that I think we have to understand. And to help us understand both sanctions and the targeting of central banks with sanctions or other forms of economic coercion, we have a very distinguished panel today, and I'm going to give them a brief introduction. If you want to learn more about their background, please go to the landing page for this event where there's a more extensive bio. First, we have Dr. Adam Tooze. He is a professor of history and director of the European Institute at Columbia University in New York. Up next, we have Delaney Simon, who is a senior analyst at the US program at the International Crisis Group. And last but not least, we have Dr. William Byrd, who is a developmental economist at the United States Institute of Peace, and with a focus on Afghanistan in particular. So let's jump right into things. And because this panel has central bank in the title, I want to unpack what central banks do in countries. I think people have a vague idea of what central banks do. They intervene during economic crises. They try to prop up the value of currencies. They try to control inflation, insert liquidity into the economy. But I think the understanding of the average person and even the average policymaker who isn't an economist is quite minimal. So I'm wondering, Adam, if you could describe to us as us laymen who are listening, what does a central bank do in a country's economy?
Well, you already gave rather an excellent list of the sort of things they've recently been doing. They do all of the things that you mentioned: intervene in crises, provide liquidity, and so on, because they are, on the one hand, responsible for the overall money supply of a country. So, and de facto, the overall money supply of a country doesn't consist really in banknotes so much as in bank credit. So what they have is a kind of overarching responsibility to manage the national banking system, which is what, say, the Federal Reserve was created for in 1913 to put an end to a disastrous run of banking crises in the United States. Sometimes that means they do regulation. Sometimes that's outsourced to another agency, but it really means that they track the business activity of banks. In a country like Russia, which is prompting, I think, today's discussion, because it's in some sense, if you like, not at the absolute core of the global financial system, central banks of that type often also have a kind of overarching responsibility for foreign exchange. So a key issue in this struggle with Russia is the way in which we've sanctioned their foreign exchange reserve. If you ask, does America have a foreign exchange reserve? The answer is no. Does the ECB in Europe have a foreign exchange reserve? No. And that's a sign of the fact that they, in emergencies, would never have any difficulty laying their hands on foreign exchange, because both the euro and the dollar are ultimately exchangeable. But if you're a central bank running a national currency that's more marginal to the global economy, then one of the things you might be Again, it could be a matter, it could be delegated to a specialist bureaucracy like in China, but broadly speaking, the monetary authorities of the country would be responsible for managing a pot of foreign exchange, which you would harvest perhaps from exporters by exchanging local currency for it, because they pay their local bills in local currency. You pile that up, and you would use that, for instance, for stabilizing the currency if you have panic selling, or backing up your debtors who might have borrowed a lot of money in dollars and might be short dollars at some moment, and then you could provide them with the dollars they need.
So when the Russian invasion of Ukraine began, and we saw the sanctions unleashed on Russia, and we saw this economic downturn in Russia and the region more broadly, we saw people buying luxury goods in Russia. I think there was a bit of a bank run, and historically speaking, what the Russian central bank would have done, if I'm not mistaken, which they did do in 2008 and in 2014, was they would have used their foreign exchange to sort of prop up the ruble, but they couldn't do that in this case because of the sanctions. Is that correct?
Yes, broadly speaking, that's right. Yeah, exactly. The blow that we delivered over that fateful weekend was to this pot of gold which the Russians had accumulated through their giant trade surpluses over the recent decades, because they export oil and gas, as we know, in huge quantities, and that earns revenue, and they don't spend it all on imports. And because this isn't just any old petrostate, this is really quite a tough petrostate, the state machine harvests that and has piled it up. And the idea is that, yes, in moments of crisis like 2008 or 2014 over Crimea, you can draw on that. And you have to understand that this is a weird world. So even though we sanctioned Russia in 2014, Russia's central bank boss was awarded not one but two prizes by the global central banking fraternity, it is largely a group of men, for her performance in managing the crisis. Right? So in a quote-unquote normal crisis, you can still use your foreign exchange to perform central bank functions. And what happened in that moment is that we took that away. And that forced the Russian central bank into much more dramatic measures.
And what has been the effect on the ruble and on the Russian economy of not being able to use those foreign exchange, the foreign exchange reserve to prop up the value of the ruble?
I mean, it's quite difficult to tell, because what they did effectively was to shut down all of Russia's financial markets and the foreign exchange market in particular, and then to manipulate the hell out of what was left. And so we're now in a kind of siege economy situation that we're used to be familiar with from, say, the Cuban example, where you have a government exchange rate which is fixed and the central bank commits to exchanging, but then the number of people who are actually permitted to exchange at that rate is very tiny and government regulated. Russian exporters have to promise to convert 80% of their exports from foreign exchange into rubles. Western investors are not free to sell off their stuff and convert it, the ruble proceeds, into dollars. So in all of these ways, we're not in a free market anymore. So it's very difficult to actually answer that question. We'll see, and we probably won't see in the short run, when they open financial markets up, and they won't open them up they won't fully liberalize them, because this is a matter of confidence amongst other things. And so preserving a veneer of normality has a powerful, very real effect, because in banking systems generally, as we know from popular presentations, Mary Poppins or whatever, if people lose confidence in the banking system, it is really broken. To the extent they maintain psychological confidence, it's really okay. And so maintaining the veneer of stability has a very real effect, and that's what the Russians are doing right now.
Well, let's shift for a moment to another country that has an even more marginal currency than the ruble, which is the Afghani in Afghanistan, and a banking sector that was already troubled. And I think it's safe to say that an entire generation of Afghans have likely lost confidence in Afghanistan's banking sector. And to give some background for those who aren't familiar, what essentially happened after the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan is that over $9 billion in Afghanistan's central bank foreign exchange reserves were frozen abroad. About 7 billion of those were in the United States, mostly in the Federal Reserve. And then half of those, I'm trying to really simplify things here, about half of that 7 billion was placed in a trust fund of sorts by the Biden administration to be used for the benefit of the Afghan people. And the other half is subject to litigation by 9/11 plaintiffs. Now, an important note here is the 9/11 plaintiffs may not be successful in that litigation. In other words, that money may eventually return to Afghanistan. But for now, they will pursue that litigation. And I think the Biden administration's reasoning in splitting that pot of money was rooted in the fact that if they were to take all of those frozen reserves and put them aside for Afghans, the 9/11 plaintiffs would have possibly had a claim under the Fifth Amendment takings clause, because the Biden administration would essentially be seizing property in which they have a property interest that's ongoing. And that's the 30,000-foot overview. It's much more complex than that. But I want to bring in Bill here and to discuss what has been the effect on Afghanistan's banking sector, and more importantly, Afghanistan's economy, from both the frozen Afghan reserves and the sanctions. And on the topic of the sanctions, I think it's important that we understand that the Taliban had been sanctioned for years by both the United States and the United Nations as a terrorist group. But what essentially happened almost overnight is that those sanctions became sanctions on the Taliban as the de facto government of Afghanistan, which is really an unprecedented event in sanctions history. So, Bill, what has been the effect on an economy like Afghanistan's?
Thanks, and I'm really happy to be here at this panel. Just to add to your background, I think 2 days after August 15th, the reserves were frozen, and that wasn't a sanctions action. It was an action because the Taliban took over and was an unrecognized regime. And I suspect, I don't know the history, but I suspect the US has done that sometime regarding other countries where there's a sudden regime change and either there's not any clarity about who's the recognized government, or basically the US is against that government and doesn't want to recognize them, which has happened with the Taliban. So that's just to add on the background. What really precipitated the economic shock was not the freezing of reserves, but the cutoff of aid, something like $8 billion a year, plus international military expenditures, which though declining were still substantial. So right away, Afghanistan suffered basically a cut of 40% of its GDP. And that, along with the snowballing lack of confidence, were the real precipitating factors behind the crisis, the economic crisis and humanitarian crisis. The freezing of reserves obviously didn't help and made things worse, because it probably might be something akin to what might have happened in Russia if the gas and oil had also been cut off and the reserves frozen. In other words, you lost all the aid and you couldn't manage that very difficult thing, even with a very substantial amount of reserves, which in the case of Afghanistan are quite high by the standards of poor countries, basically, a little less than a year's imports worth, which is far above the usual minimum standards for the amount of reserves that kind of country should hold. So the freezing hurt by stopping any ability to manage the macroeconomy, bring in dollars to stabilize the exchange rate. It also hurt the already, as you said, ailing banking system. Around 900 million of those frozen reserves actually are the foreign exchange reserves of commercial banks deposited with the central bank. And they're actually more than that too, but those are the required reserves that they were required to deposit with the central bank. So it's definitely has a bad impact on the banking system. Again, I would just end up stressing that the economic shock has been mainly not from the freezing of reserves, but from the points I mentioned, and really a snowballing economic decline, loss of confidence. And just to emphasize one final point is actually the Afghan government, nor the central bank, nor any other government agency, nor any commercial bank has actually been sanctioned. So there was a probable overinterpretation of sanctions at the beginning, which belatedly and over time has been corrected. And most recently in February, Treasury issued a clarification that no government agency, nor the central bank, nor commercial banks are sanctioned. Aid, humanitarian, and commercial transactions involving them are perfectly okay. except for a few identified luxury goods. And you'll laugh when you hear this, including yachts and furs, which are about the last thing someone would want to import into Afghanistan. I'll stop there, and we could go more into the court case, which I think is really a distinctive feature that applies in Afghanistan and probably doesn't apply in most of the other cases.
So at the risk of being a moderator who's too talkative, I want to explore that last point for a moment, because I think it was positive to see the US Treasury Department release FAQs related to what the sanctions are and aren't. Of course, the sanctions were always on the Taliban. They were never on the territory of Afghanistan. They were never comprehensive sanctions, so to speak, such as what we see in North Korea. But in effect, they were having that effect. And I was very happy to see General License 20, which you alluded to, in which OFAC permitted incidental payments that would reach the Taliban related to commercial trade, cross-border trade. In other words, you can pay customs duties, you can pay taxes, even if it reaches the Taliban. And that cross-border trade is essential to Afghanistan's economy. Of course, these traders don't really want to accept Afghanis, they need to accept dollars. And yet I was just in Pakistan. I came back from Pakistan just last night, and I spoke to a lot of different folks in Pakistan's government and in civil society. And I asked them, what is the effect of GL20? Has it had any effect on Pakistan's banking sector in terms of authorizing, transactions with Afghanistan? And they said no. Pakistan is still on the FATF gray list, and these banks are still risk averse about doing cross-border transactions with Afghanistan. So the numbers I hear, and I'm not talking about refugees, we're talking about crossings at Chaman border of something like 400,000 per month, and crossings at both ways, crossings at Torkham border of something like 200,000 a month. So there is trade going on. I'm told that it's being conducted by the Hawala networks, so we have envelopes and suitcases of cash going across the border. And, is that really good from an anti-money laundering perspective or a countering of terrorist financing perspective? And how, what can the US government do to really communicate, no, it is okay to conduct these commercial transactions. GL20 is a real thing. How do you get over the chilling effect of sanctions? That's what I'm really asking.
Yeah, I think it would have probably been better if the GL20 had been issued in September than in February, just because, a lot of attitudes and practices got entrenched. From what I hear is similar, and I would guess the Pakistani banks probably have more reason to be nervous and cautious, but the same thing is happening with money center banks, with banks that have had long-standing correspondent relations with the Afghan banks, by the way, and some of the Afghan banks are quite credible in terms of their own prudential practices and AML CFT. So what seems to be happening is that the sanctions were used as an excuse not to engage with Afghanistan, which in any case had lost all profitability now that the international military contracts and aid and et cetera were being declined. So apparently the sort of the big actors among banks are still refusing, even though I think the Treasury has been quite clear on that. And then, so the question is whether public pressure could be mounted, corporate responsibility or something. Those are sort of broader aspects. My own view is that Treasury has done about all it can in terms of officially clarifying the sanctions, short of actually then, recognizing the Taliban or actually removing sanctions from the individuals in the Taliban and Haqqani network. I think it would also help probably if the Taliban did not appoint sanctioned individuals to be the Minister of Finance and the central bank governor. So that's another aspect where I think that, the Taliban economic management has also fallen short, and they have good reasons to be concerned about the situation, but it's not like they've been proactively dealing with it. But right, I would say in a nutshell, it's fear of sanctions, not the sanctions themselves, that is one of the problems in Afghanistan.
So in Afghanistan, we have this aggregate effect. We have an economy that was already dysfunctional. We have public spending in which 75% of public spending was already grant funded. We have a war economy that evaporated overnight. We have the frozen reserves. We have the sanctions that have essentially become imposed on what's the de facto government. We have and then because the United States and the international community has left, and with that, the war economy has left, we've de-incentivized from a business perspective doing business in Afghanistan. Simply put, the risk is much higher than the potential reward. It is the ultimate frontier economy at this point. Is that a good summary?
Yeah, I would just add that the informal sector has held up much better, and you alluded to that. Trade is going on, and it's funded through Havala and other informal mechanisms. As far as I know, the ongoing what I've called looting of Afghan mineral resources is alive and well, probably about $1 to $2 billion a year, so up to 10% of GDP. The opium economy is going well, and of course, in a very entrepreneurial way, they found a natural ingredient for methamphetamine. So that's also taken off and is quite cost effective, given that the plant grows wild in the mountains and people just need to harvest it. So it's actually more profitable than opium, probably, given all the the problem that you have to cultivate opium and there are significant production costs. So there's part of the economy that's alive and well, and even if it's not increasing in absolute terms, it's definitely increasing in relative terms as the urban economy basically collapses.
I mean, would you say is it a fair statement to say that in some sense, U.S. sanctions, and I know it's not, I know aid is a big factor here, Taliban mismanagement is a big factor here, but U.S. sanctions have disincentivized the formal economy and sort of been a boon to the informal economy because of that chilling effect and that fear you've talked about?
Yeah, again, I would just come back. I don't think it's the sanctions themselves, especially after GL20. It's fear of the sanctions. And, you get in these kind of very awkward and contradictory things that aid agencies are freely allowed to use the Havala, but to get money, sent by a US bank into an Afghan bank is very problematic. And what kind of risk management approach is that the Havala is freely permitted, officially permitted, and yet the banking system is gummed up and the foreign banks are not willing to engage in transactions. That doesn't make much sense to me, but I'm an economist, not a sanctions expert, I should be clear.
Well, look, I agree with you there. And I think in some sense, some of our listeners might hear you saying, well, it's not the sanctions themselves, it's fear of the sanctions. And they might think, well, that's a distinction without a difference. And I remember I was on calls with Treasury that were meant for NGOs, in which the Treasury Department, now this was before GL20. This was at a time when when OFAC had issued a general license that said, if you were engaging in humanitarian aid activities, it was okay to engage in incidental payments that might reach the Taliban. And then folks would ask, well, what about commercial activities? And the Treasury Department would say, oh, well, there's no sanctions related to commercial activities. But of course, the logical implication of having a general license related to incidental payments for humanitarian activities is that those incidental payments wouldn't be permitted for commercial activities. And I think that was part of the motivation for General License 20. But as we're seeing, it hasn't had that much of an effect. We've spoken offline before, and you've talked about sanctions management versus a zero tolerance risk policy. And do you think there's, something within the culture of U.S. sanctions enforcement that has increased the chilling effect of U.S. sanctions in a way that's possibly detrimental to U.S. interests?
Yeah, that's a tough question, but I think I would keep coming back to, you really need to look at the big picture and what are the impacts of sanctions, or in this case, I would argue fear of sanctions versus other alternatives, right? I mean, does it make sense to push Afghanistan into the informal economy much more, Does it make sense for aid agencies to use the Havala? And for example, another example, UN agencies are free to pay the Taliban for security costs, which can encompass all kinds of expenditures to the benefit of the Taliban. But a commercial company wanting to import, say, inputs for one of their factories in Afghanistan, up until GL20 faced problems and probably still faces problems, not due to the sanctions, but due to US banks not wanting to handle those transactions, and even banks in the Middle East, et cetera. So, yeah, I think it needs a, as I think with the case with which I'm more familiar with, counter narcotics and others, you have these specialized bureaucracies for whom that is the be all and end all, and they don't, there's not a more whole of government approach on the bigger picture. I think things have evolved on the US side with regard to Afghanistan significantly and positively, but it would have probably been better if it was earlier rather than waiting until February.
Thanks for that. And Delaney, I want to bring you in, but before I do so, I just want to remind those viewers that you can submit questions via the Q&A box. I will try to get to some of those questions. Please try to make those questions and not, 2-paragraph blocks of commentary. I am not talented enough to read and moderate at the same time, although I'm sure some of the comments are excellent. So if you can try to keep them to questions, there will be a greater likelihood that I ask them. Delaney, let me bring you in for a moment, because we've talked about central banks, we've talked about sanctions. What you're really looking at sanctions these days from a peace building perspective and a conflict management perspective. Why don't you tell me a little bit more about that?
Sure. Thank you so much for including me on this panel, Adam. And my background is, I'm not a sanctions expert either, but I have spent most of my career working in conflict zones. And so I come to this discussion with questions like, can sanctions promote peace, or do they do the opposite? And so at Crisis Group, we're working on a series of reports looking at how sanctions affect conflict zones in particular. The first report that we're working on is specifically on sanctions and peace. This question of, can sanctions help promote peace, or can sanctions have an unintended consequence of promoting dynamics that lead to war or that exacerbate the negative effects of war? So I spent 2 weeks in Colombia recently with the FARC, looking at how sanctions affected the FARC after they had signed the peace deal with the Colombian government. So they signed a peace deal in 2016 with the Colombian government, but they remained sanctioned by the United States for 3 years after the peace deal was signed. And what I found when I was in Colombia was that actually the fact that sanctions were still in place, and this was a foreign terrorist designation amongst other sanctions, so it's a very specific thing, as Dr. Bird knows, and as you know from the Afghanistan case. But what I saw was that it made it very difficult to implement the peace deal, because former combatants were still under sanctions, and therefore they couldn't open bank accounts. They had trouble accessing legal frameworks, accessing banks, accessing rental agreements, and NGOs had trouble engaging with them. Peace building NGOs had trouble facilitating their integration back into Colombian society. And so I was very interested to see how US sanctions policy sort of sat at cross purposes to US policy in general, because the United States was a big supporter of the peace agreement in Colombia. And so as we look at sanctions from the Crisis Group perspective in the future, we're sort of thinking about how sanctions can be used to promote peace. And so I don't focus on Russia or Ukraine. We have colleagues at Crisis Group who've worked on this issue for years. But even as I'm thinking about that issue, and as they're thinking about that issue, we're all thinking about how can we use sanctions in the best way to promote peace, both during the conflict to lead to hopefully a peace agreement, and then afterwards, after the war is over, how can we use sanctions in a way that promotes peace rather than detracts from peace? I'll stop there.
Are these in conflict though? I think the intentions of sanctions are often to promote an end to conflict, or to at least theoretically that's what they're for, to alter a belligerent's behavior, to act as a stick, which is in the title of this panel. But it does become very politically costly to remove those sanctions once a settlement is found, for the very reason that settlements and conflict are a good settlement is typically not really acceptable to anyone. Everybody has a problem with it. And to engage in a counterfactual, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if the Ghani administration had come to an agreement with the Taliban and there had been some sort of power sharing government, and we still saw sanctioned and designated individuals in the government. How would the United States and the world have dealt with that? Because that, in theory, would have been the best case scenario. And so these best case scenarios, which we saw in Colombia in some sense, and which unfortunately can only be a counterfactual in Afghanistan at this stage, oftentimes fall short of what people wanted. And so is it not really politically costly to remove those sanctions? And if it's politically costly to remove sanctions, even after peace is achieved, isn't it a significant risk to impose those sanctions to begin with?
Yeah, so I think it's important to ask ourselves some policy questions about sanctions. One is, are we being realistic about what sanctions can do? And in the Colombia case, I think that there were many that hoped that sanctions would force the FARC to give up their arms, that sanctions would sort of make the FARC virtually powerless, that sanctions would weaken their resolve to fight the Colombian state. That didn't happen. There are a lot of parallels in other cases where sanctions were used. I mean, Afghanistan also is a parallel. Taliban were sanctioned for years, and we see sort of the proof is in the pudding in terms of their effectiveness in making the Taliban go away. But the other question that I think you raise is, are sanctions nimble enough for purpose? And it is really difficult. Even all of these problems that I've identified in the Colombia case, I mean, from a sanctions perspective, that was a tremendous achievement because sanctions were lifted, and it's incredibly rare for a foreign terrorist designation to be lifted, as you know. I mean, it just doesn't happen. It's so politically toxic in the United States for a variety of reasons, and it's especially toxic when the group that is designated or the individual that is designated is responsible for gross atrocities. It's very hard for publics to accept that sanctions will be lifted. I mean, a sanctions expert, which I'm not, would say that sanctions shouldn't be a punitive tool. So they shouldn't be a tool to punish for atrocities. We have other means in the international system to do that, problematic as they are. And yet there's a lot of rhetoric today around using, all the cases we're discussing on this panel, but using sanctions to punish a group for the atrocities that they've committed. That just becomes problematic because the deterrent value of sanctions is limited when they'll never be lifted, right? Which brings me to a third question I think maybe is worth considering, which is, how can we use sanctions as leverage? And can we use sanctions as leverage in negotiations to end conflict? And I know this is a question that's come up in Afghanistan. You know a lot more about this than I do. It's a question that's coming up in Ukraine, and it's a question that came up in Colombia, but became more difficult because sanctions remained in place after a peace agreement was signed.
Adam, can I just interject a second, because I'm actually finding the conversation hard to follow, because when you say it's politically prohibitively expensive to lift sanctions, we're talking about the United States, right? And we're talking about congressional politics. And in that case, we really shouldn't generalize from the Colombian, Irani, Afghani cases to the Russian case. It's virtually inconceivable to imagine that the sanctions adopted by Europe and the United States against the Russian central bank will be permanent. I mean, that's a scenario that I don't think anyone conceives of. So we have to, I think, recognize the difference between essentially like one-way, highly politicized American decisions with regards to economies, which from the American point of view are trivially insignificant, And so it just really doesn't matter whether you mess with Afghanistan or Colombia or Cuba or for as long as you like, and if necessary to eternity, because some GOP congressperson can't get past themselves. But when we're talking about a decision by the transatlantic financial community to impose sanctions on the Russian central bank, we're in a different world. And at that point, I think we just need to, just so that we're in like a reasonable mental space, we just need to be clear about this difference, because big parts of the global energy economy will not function long term unless basic functions are restored to the Russian central bank. That has to be understood as a tactical measure. And if that's too much for the American political system to process, well, okay, but as far as I understand it, Congress wasn't really involved in any of those decisions anyway. So those are on-off switches you can presumably switch. And in any case, America's senior partners in Europe who actually have serious vested interest in this. And the same is true with Iran, right? I mean, Europe actually has serious money at stake in Iran. They're just not going to tolerate that kind of immobility on the American side. So mine is sort of A, a question, B, a kind of almost a note of indignation, I will grant, because this discourse is dissociated from reality at some point. And then thirdly, this may also just be a crisis diagnosis. There may be trouble down the line if America understands sanctions against Russia in the mode of its sanctions against FARC or the Taliban, then, we're headed for some seriously deep water 1 or 2 years from now, because large parts of heavily invested and serious money do not understand them that way. So if that is you see my point, right?
Well, I think your point is right. I was actually going to come to you next to talk about that sort of dichotomy. And I can't help think that in terms of sanctions regimes, it's sometimes, I can think of the same criticism that African countries have had of the ICC, that there's one rule for powerful countries, in the Northern Hemisphere, and there's another rule for the global South. And that rule, that disparity applies to, prosecutions in the ICC, and maybe it applies to the longevity of sanctions, and I guess we'll see. And we could get into the ethics of that. Maybe there's another panel for that. In terms of the impermanence of Russian sanctions, I think and I'm not an expert on this, I think most folks in government probably understand that Europe is dependent on Russia in a way that nobody is dependent on FARC or Afghanistan or even Iran. But you talked about an on-off switch, and I guess my concern is that the actors in charge of that on-off switch themselves are beholden to congressional politics. In other words, a presidential administration still has to think about the discourse, even if it's detached from reality. And so that would be my pushback against that point, although you know far more than I. So I'd like to follow up with a question, which is, what has been the effect of the sanctions on Russian decision making in your view, to the extent that you have any insights into that? What has been the effect on the economy? I know you say we're still waiting to see. What has been the secondary effect on Europe's economy? And how do you think lifting of those sanctions would play out economically speaking? I know that's like a 3-part question, but to the extent you can remember it and answer it, I appreciate it.
I don't think there's any reason to expect it'll have any impact on decision making. Surely we cannot be that deluded to imagine that the sanctions will work in that way. Like, there's really no good analysis of the Kremlin regime that would suggest that the people immediately hurt by this have any influence over the decision making. We are in a war. This is now a proper war, not it's gone from the sort of war of choice category to the proper war. We need some kind of a win out of this. And that's what drives everything from the Russian side, I would imagine. That would certainly be my working model. Once we get some kind of win, and then for the Russians, which then enables them to engage in peace negotiations, which is when things get really tough, then it's possible that the sanctions pressure might, as it were, speed up the Russian clock in some way. But and no doubt, lifting of the sanctions will be a condition in the peace negotiations. It's something they're going to want to haggle over, because they will regard us quite reasonably as party to the conflict, and so they'll want that to be resolved. What is the impact on the Russian economy so far? It's too early to tell, in a sense, and because they're a highly sophisticated, diversified economy like the Iranian economy, but even more so, one shouldn't expect sudden heart attack, flatlining, collapse, right? That's not what happens. As Bill was saying about Afghanistan as well, even a country with as limited resources as Afghanistan adjusts, and it takes various different forms. What we've seen in the Iranian case is we have a sudden collapse in output followed by a recovery and a stabilization at a lower level and then slower growth. And I think we're going through those phases in the Russian case. We spoke about financial markets. They paralyze those, which is exactly what you'd expect to do, kind of medically induced coma to kind of stabilize the patient. And then what you do beyond that is you begin improvising. I think it's going to take months rather than days and weeks to see the full effect, though, because, for instance, somebody was telling me that Russians who, they access the internet via VPNs. You pay for a VPN with a Visa card. Your Visa card's still good for a couple more months. At some point, it's no longer going to be good. And then the Russian middle class is going to lose access to the internet. That's really going to hurt. So it's going to be those kind of effects. There were panic buying of pharmaceuticals in the first couple of phases. What was your third question? I remember the first two, and the third one slipped.
I think the third question was how long would it take for the economy to stabilize afterwards? But let's table that for a moment, because you raise an interesting point about the Russian middle class, which I think does distinguish Russia from Afghanistan and the FARC and Iran even, is that you have this population that's integrated with the rest of the world. You have a Russian middle class that became accustomed to flying to Paris, for a holiday perhaps, or flying to Turkey for a holiday. Became accustomed to accessing Facebook, things like this. I mean, does that have an effect over time that's markedly different than these other sanctions examples?
Well, I mean, the tragedy of Afghanistan is that in embryonic form that existed there too, right? And those are precisely the groups that we abandoned. This is the important counter, right? So right now, the German idea of Wandel durch Handel, transformation through trade, is highly unfashionable. But I think people kind of glory in pointing out how naive it was. And I think really the naivety lies in the critics, in the sense that anyone who imagined that was really some sort of metaphysics of social and historical transformation was always barking up the wrong tree. It was actually always a power play. It was about how fast and how rapidly could you re-engineer societies such that those groups became dominant. And what we've seen in the Russian case is that we didn't do it fast enough. It wasn't rapid enough. It wasn't deep enough. And genuine social transformation, which affects tens of millions of people, including students of mine at Columbia, wasn't enough to shift the power balance, because political power is autonomous from economic and social transformation, right? The two, only in rather naive theories of historical transformation does one map onto the other, and they really don't. And that's what we're seeing in China. That's what we've seen in Russia. That's also what we saw in Afghanistan. It doesn't translate into a viable military in the Afghani case. Whereas in Ukraine, it turns out that almost immeasurable social and economic change, which doesn't show up in the economic aggregates, still enable them to build a capable anti-tank force, right? So there's a in terms of policy analysis, there's a huge gap between genuine changes in the social composition of societies and the efficacy of that in political and geopolitical terms. And that's the tragedy of the Russian situation. Does it, in the long run, mean there's a clock ticking on Putin's regime? I wouldn't be optimistic enough to claim that at this current moment. And of course, there are countervailing forces. They'll create some national VPN or some other kind of mechanism that will allow them to satisfy the needs of their population. There's no reason why they shouldn't be able to follow the Chinese path in that respect, or the Saudi, the Gulf states all do this. So I would expect adaptation on the part of the regime. But the tragedy is real, right? The destruction of the expectations and the future trajectories imagined by, in the Russian case, tens of millions of people is absolutely real. And you see that even in the actions of Western corporates, right? What's really striking about them is the headline is they're pulling out. The reality is they're still continuing right now to pay wages and salaries. McDonald's, I think, has an unlimited, indefinite horizon on that. IKEA, I think, committed to 3 months. And so they are maintaining faith with the people that work for them, and presumably that implies a horizon in which they imagine that we might move back out of the sanctions regime and it might be viable for them to re-engage.
So I want to ask one follow-up, and I know I've been asking question after question of you, but we, on the topic of lifting of sanctions, on the one hand, you say that there's this horizon in which, because of the realities of the European economy and so forth, the sanctions will have to be lifted at some point on Russia. But what will the reintegration of Russia into the global economy really look like? Because it strikes me, and I'm not an economist, that there's going to be other problems besides just sanctions. The sanctions can be lifted, but how are you going to ensure business? How are you going to ensure transactions? How are you going to attract venture capital? Is there going to be any confidence in the Russian economy, not just because of sanctions from the West, but also because of the haphazardness and unpredictability of Putin himself? And what is going to be the long-term effect of this episode on willingness to do business in Russia?
I mean, the specific element of the sanctions I was referring to when I had that outburst earlier is the central bank element, right? That's the bit where it's virtually unimaginable that because we're talking about $500 billion. We're not talking, small money here. We're talking about a huge set of assets which have been impounded. It's very difficult to understand how one could not, free that up progressively. The other point to make is right here, right now, as we speak, Europeans are still paying hundreds of millions of dollars for Russian gas as the war is going on. So, are we capable of finding our way towards some sort of compromise over this? We already live it. We're living the dirty compromise. The compromise can only get less dirty than it currently is. Because currently we're paying for the gas even as the war's been going. If they get to a ceasefire, are we suddenly going to stop paying for the gas? No, not on those grounds, right? And Europe is working its way around painfully to moving to a position where it could conceive of shutting that off. I hope it hasn't happened this morning. I haven't tracked the news today. But we may be on the cusp of doing it. But those are the sorts of muddy compromises that we're going to engage in. Russia has been under various types of sanctions since 2014, right? So there is a whole grey zone, a whole spectrum of options here that we will no doubt be in for the foreseeable future. But A, energy will likely continue to flow, and B, the central bank bit, it just seems very difficult to see how you could uphold that particular aspect. Strikes against individual oligarchs, sure, that's easy. That's the FARC analogy, right? We can all do without them. But $500 billion of a G20 central bank's assets frozen temporarily is a different kettle of fish.
Although for some time it seemed like Europe wasn't willing to do without the Russian oligarchs. Is that a fair statement? I mean, there was some real hesitancy.
Everyone likes oligarchs. Hell, America likes oligarchs too. This is only too well documented. A certain American president was only too happy to do business with these people. Of course, it's a question, but there's different levels of interest, right? Clearly, it's bad for the high-end property market in London if you make these kind of strikes, but that's very different from saying 13% of Germany's net primary energy input comes in this particular form, and that's what we're going to touch. Those are two very different levels of entanglement. They have also very different politics, which is, as you saw in the congressional response to the president's State of the Union, striking at other people's very wealthy people is good politics. You'll get a spontaneous bipartisan cheer for doing that in the United States and in many other European countries as well. Very different matter when we're talking about gas prices.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Sorry, I want to back up for a moment and ask a really general question, because I feel like we've gone into the weeds a bit. And I want to point out, despite the real difference between the Russian case, the Colombian case that we've talked about, the Afghan case, and the Iranian case that we've alluded to, and that difference being a big actor that Europe relies upon and small actors that are not as integrated into the global economy. Despite that difference, the common thread I've heard is that sanctions don't really affect the strategic decision-making that they're purported to affect. So they didn't really affect, if I understood you correctly, Delaney, they didn't affect the FARC's behavior. They didn't really affect the Taliban's behavior, and they still don't seem to be affecting that. Even the prospect of lifting them doesn't seem to be affecting the Taliban's behavior. They're not affecting the Kremlin's decision-making. And maybe that's a generalization, but in some sense, is it fair to say that if there is any deterrent or coercive power of sanctions, it's the threat of the imposition, and that once you've imposed them, in some sense, you've already lost? Is that a fair statement or not? Delaney?
Thanks, Adam. I think maybe I'd want to add some nuance, which is that we just have to be realistic about what sanctions can do. When our goals are very lofty, it's easy sort of to be disappointed. And I think, I mean, just to take the Colombia case, which is because I'm familiar with it, there were a lot of ideas about big things that sanctions could achieve that they didn't achieve. So I think if I were to summarize my point, it's that sanctions aren't a magic bullet, right? But I'm not confident enough to say that they make no impact and change of behavior. I think I'm still figuring that out in the Colombia case. I mean, there are arguments that sanctions deprived the FARC of some funding because it made it difficult for them to fund their war effort, and so maybe that played a role. But I think the greater faith we have in sanctions being able to bring around these huge changes of behavior, I think we need to temper that faith, because I think we're bound to be disappointed.
Of course, Bill.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe add and take that further. I'm not an expert at all, but I can't think of an example where sanctions actually stopped a war from starting or in themselves ended a war. And I realize the Quincy Institute's philosophy, but it seems that at least in the Russia case, the sanctions are being chosen as an alternative to military intervention, whereas as far as I can see, looking broadly, and others would know better, but I'll just put it out, is that it's military actions and intervention that actually stop atrocities. And so so I'm saying that, and one of the questions alluded to, it seems the sanctions are the alternative to going to war, and I'm not debating that, but do they actually work as an alternative to going to war, let's say in stopping atrocities in the Balkans or other kinds of conflicts? It's really, I do agree with Delaney that their benefits are often overstated. They're often sort of feel good in the sense of imposing some punishment, but do they really work? I think it's worthy of study whether they worked. I mean, you go back to the oil embargo against Japan. That certainly didn't stop Pearl Harbor from happening. Arguably, it maybe stimulated the Japanese to take desperate and somewhat foolhardy measures.
So let me take it a step.
There's another alternative, though, Bill, which is the alternative is surely to do nothing. And sanctions, I think, seem preferable both to military intervention and to doing nothing. And that's surely the dilemma. The pure stand back and just wait, let it happen position is intolerable, I think. It's very difficult to maintain it, and given what's going on. And as you say, then the military option is too risky, certainly in relation to Russia. And there's really basically no legal grounds for it, right? I mean, Ukraine is not a NATO partner. It doesn't have a solid security treaty that would warrant it. So, and just one further point on like this, what do they do? I think a further justification is that in the long run, they attrit the capacity of whoever you're applying them to do anything. Right? The aim of the game is to inflict damage and to, for instance, in the Iranian case or the North Korean case, just limit the power of the regime to mobilize resources, offer its citizens good trade-offs. It's just the aim of the game is to constrain their sovereignty in important ways, and that ultimately, I think, is the rationale in relation to Russia. A, we've got to do something. We can't do war, and B, this in the long run will constrict Putin's regime. And that's the fundamental logic.
So I think you've answered Jean's question in the audience. I want to acknowledge another question, which was from Arpita, who asked about some legal details about the Central Bank of Afghanistan. Arpita, I would point you to Scott Anderson's article in Lawfare. You can Google Lawfare, what's happening with Afghanistan's assets. I think it will answer the two questions you have in the chat. We simply don't have the time or bandwidth to get into those details on this panel, although it's a very good question. So far as Bill, you alluded to the Quincy Institute's positions, I would just ask the viewers to go to Responsible Statecraft and look at some of the writing on sanctions with regards to Russia. There was substantial support for the sanctions on the oligarchs. I think there's been nuanced positions on other sanctions regarding Russia and recognizing the unique nature of the conflict. I'm not going to speak for our experts, because I'm not an expert on Russia, I would just say go to Responsible Statecraft, and the articles speak for themselves. And I think that they'll be of interest to those who are viewing. Now, so far as you've talked about Russia, Adam, but I want to talk about these other countries that are the typical recipients or targets of sanctions in closing out this panel, which is, countries like Iran, countries like Afghanistan, Colombia, groups like the FARC, and so forth. If sanctions don't prevent war, and if, especially in cases where we're not willing to go to war, does it make ethical or policy sense to engage in sanctions in a situation where we don't think it's going to change the target actor, and that it might inflict significant harm on the population? Does it still make sense to engage in sanctions in those situations? And I guess I'll start with Delaney and maybe go to Bill.
From my perspective, and also the perspective of my organization, Crisis Group, I think we deal with a number of countries in conflicts, and we haven't had a singular policy line on the use of sanctions. We think about sanctions in terms of how they can affect particular contexts, and we've recommended the use of sanctions in cases where we think they'll help promote peace, mitigate violence. I think we've taken the line that we shouldn't deprive ourselves of a tool that could potentially stop war or lessen its effects. And I think that's the way to go with this. I mean, sanctions and military conflict are not the only tools at our disposal for addressing conflict, right? I know it's easy to make that simplification sometimes. So we have to be sort of creative and far-reaching about the use of tools in our toolkits to address conflict. And I think it would be unwise to give up sanctions as a tool. Even considering all of its problems, I think there may be some cases when it could actually help to mitigate conflict, and we don't want to get rid of that possibility for ourselves.
But it shouldn't be a knee-jerk tool. You're saying that we shouldn't give it up altogether as a strict policy, no sanctions ever, but that if I understand you correctly, and based on our conversations, it shouldn't just be this knee-jerk reaction of, well, we don't want to go to war, so let's slap some sanctions.
Yeah, and I think, as I said, it's not a magic bullet. It's like an overused term in the policy world. It's not a magic bullet, but it really isn't. And we have to be, like I said before, realistic about what it can achieve. If there's a problem and then policymakers implement sanctions and then expect the problem to be fixed, it's a very simplistic way to address very complicated issues, right? So yeah, we're on the same page on that one.
Bill, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, very quickly, a few points. One, I would just like to point out that actually I've written about the big impact on the global poor from the whole Russia-Ukraine war is going to be on food. And that's because Ukraine is also a big grain exporter, and Russia's exports also will be affected. So I just wanted to highlight again, and the sanctions are not playing the main role in food. It's blockages in the Black Sea and conflict, et cetera. And back to Adam's point, which is a good one, I would just highlight, I think it's really the weapons supply and training to Ukraine, which helped probably more than the sanctions. One question that comes up to me is, and Zelensky raised it, I'm no expert, but if you really want the sanctions to deter, you should start imposing them before the war starts rather than only after the fact. Look, I'm an economist, so I'm a terrible person to ask about ethics, but what are the ethics of segregating $3.5 billion of Afghanistan's own state economic reserves for 9/11 plaintiffs? Where's the ethics there? It makes little sense, and the Taliban was neither a planner or implementer of 9/11, and the case involved of over 7 billion summary judgment had about, I think, several score defendants, of which the Taliban was only one, and others like Iran had nothing to do with 9/11 at all. So I do think, if we're looking at the ethics, one should look at that and what is a responsible position. My last point, I think, and this is more maybe throwing it to Adam. I think you've never had such a such a comprehensive case on such a large country. So this is really going to be a test case. I mean, if the sanctions don't work in affecting Russia's calculations and Russia's, ability to wage war, if they don't work in this case, then I think the lesson will be that really they don't work very well, because it's really been unprecedented, and the change in European attitudes has been most striking, except for the gas, which of course is the big exception. But so I think it'll be a test case in Russia, and we'll see.
If I could be permitted just one final observation, I mean, I'm really struck a little worried, frankly, Adam, by your framing of this, like the willingness to go to war should be the benchmark of our seriousness in policy. I mean, coming from a West German background, war is ruled out by law, by constitutional law. War is not an option of policy. Seriously, it should not be an option of policy. With regard to Russia in particular, it clearly can't be a policy. This is at least one shred of wisdom that the American national security establishment has rescued from the Cold War, is that a direct confrontation with Russia is lethally dangerous and must be ruled out at all costs, right? So then the question is, in the space left by that basic axiom, what options do you have? And I take Bill's point exactly, that various types of proxy measure, in other words, supplying weapons and training, may be effective means. Diplomacy, presumably, is something we should be thinking about. Working on other partners of Russia, China, for instance, to exert pressure in India. But sanctions then are front and center, because essentially they're, in the first instance, and in a direct way, non-lethal. And they involve us simply withholding our engagement in commercial transactions. They are not the same as firing missiles. They are radically and qualitatively different. Now, they have all sorts of problems, and we should therefore have a critical discourse about them. But that's why they're so fundamental, I would have thought, for modern statecraft, is that they just simply consist in us saying, no more banking for you in Wall Street. And that is a useful and powerful thing that we need to have in our repertoire.
I'm going to give myself permission to go over 2 minutes. I'd say, like, the framing of the
come
question.
back quickly on that. Sorry, the example I think of is the Balkans. What stopped the atrocities and war there was the very belated U.S. and European intervention militarily, right? Nothing was stopping the carnage in the Balkans until that. So, I mean, I don't disagree with you about Russia, and I'm not suggesting at all to go to war with Russia, but I do think the question was, are sanctions seen as the alternative to war? And if you're looking at it from atrocity prevention, I'm not so sure.
And I would just say, I think this is in some sense a US based panel. And so it's in a way, from a US perspective, the framing of the questions, at least from those that come from me. And I think we have to remember that in the case of US foreign policy, particularly over the last 20 years, war has not been off the table. In fact, there's plenty of Congress members and there's plenty of folks in Washington who think a direct conflict with Russia, whether in the form of a no-fly zone or even beyond that, is acceptable. So war has not been off the table. So in that context, I don't think that the question of sanctions can necessarily be decoupled from war in terms of how we think about it analytically. But the question, of course, was meant as an open-ended question. But with that, I think it's most appropriate to perhaps end with an open question for everyone that none of us will answer, just something to think about. It's a question from the audience, Daniel. He said, do we think the choice between sanctions, war, or nothing are too limited? Can we talk about security assurances, civilian-based defense systems, nonviolent intervention, and diplomacy as alternatives? And of course, sanctions might be part of that. I don't personally think sanctions are non-lethal. I think we have to always keep in mind, in the back of our heads, the lethality of sanctions, either in the Iran case, the Iraq case, and perhaps even ultimately in the Russia case, although that remains to be seen. And certainly in the case of Afghanistan, real people do die because of sanctions. Now, of course, they are qualitatively different from firing a missile. And of course, I know this as a former Marine that it's qualitatively different from active combat. But I think we have to keep that in mind. And I just wonder why in Washington, and this is not directed at any of the esteemed panelists, we spend so much time focused on intervention and so much time focused on sanctions, and perhaps not enough time on these other forms of conflict mitigation that were raised in this last question, which due to time, we will have to keep as an open-ended rhetorical question. And with that, I'd like to thank all the listeners and the panelists. It's been a lot to try to cover in 1 hour. I think we probably needed 4 hours and maybe 3 sub-panels to really do this justice. But so thank you for your time, and please check out Quincy Institute's website for future panels.
Thank you.